Hospital ships weren't supposed to be beautiful. They were supposed to be functional, white hulls, broad silhouettes, slow-moving and obvious, announcing themselves to every sensor array within 100,000 kilometers. The red cross markings on her flanks were 300 meters tall. Her transponder broadcast on 47 frequencies simultaneously, in 17 languages, including 3 that humans had only learned to speak in the last decade. She glowed on every detection spectrum, like a lighthouse dropped into the middle of an ocean. She was supposed to be invisible in a different way, the kind of invisible that comes from being too sacred to touch. Dr. Nora Vass stood at the observation window on Deck 7 and watched the stars and did not think about her daughter. She was getting better at that. Not good, better. There was a difference, and some days a difference felt like enough to keep standing. The Caduceus Meridian carried 812 patients, 14 different species. Injuries from the Verity Corridor engagement 3 weeks ago, where a misunderstanding about navigational boundary markers had turned into a 6-hour firefight that nobody had technically started and everyone had technically lost. Nora had spent 19 hours in surgery during the immediate aftermath. She'd saved 31 lives and lost 9, and the math of that still lived somewhere behind her sternum, in a place that didn't have a clinical name. She was the ship's chief medical officer. She was 44 years old. She had gray at her temples that she stopped trying to cover 2 years ago, and hands that had stopped shaking in surgery about 6 months after her daughter's funeral, which she counted as a kind of recovery, even if no grief counsel would have framed it that way. Dr. Vass. The voice came from the corridor behind her. She recognized it without turning. Lieutenant Commander Petrosolano, the ship's operations officer, one of only 43 crew members who were technically military personnel aboard a vessel carrying 800 civilians and medical staff. Captain wants you on the bridge. What is it? A pause. Petra was not someone who paused. Vethkai warship, bearing down on us, not responding to hails. Nora turned from the window. How long? 11 minutes before they're in weapons range. They're already in weapons range. Actually, they just haven't fired yet. She walked. The bridge of the Caduceus Meridian was not designed for tension. It was designed for coordination, wide, open plan, with medical monitoring stations alongside navigation and communication consoles, because on a hospital ship the line between clinical work and ship operations blurred constantly. Right now it felt wrong. Too bright. Too orderly for what was happening on the screens. Captain Idris Falk was a compact man with the particular stillness of someone who trained himself out of visible panic over the course of a long career. He was standing at the central display, and Nora could see the Vethkai vessel on the tactical screen, a long, angular thing that looked like a vertebra from some enormous animal, all ridged bone-white ceramic plating and asymmetrical protrusions. Vethkai ships were always slightly wrong to human eyes. They were built by beings who perceived geometry through a sensory organ that had no human equivalent, something between echolocation and electromagnetic sensitivity, and the result was architecture that was structurally sound but visually uncomfortable. Nora, Falk acknowledged her without looking away from the screen. I want you here because you've had more direct Vethkai contact than anyone else on board. That was true. She'd treated 17 Vethkai patients in the last 2 years. She knew their physiology better than any human doctor outside the specialist centers on Kepler Station. She knew the way their secondary circulatory system responded to trauma, the way their pain expression manifested as a specific subharmonic vibration in their resonance membranes rather than vocalizations, the way they went very still when they were afraid instead of moving fast the way humans did. She looked at the ship on the screen. They haven't fired, she said. Not yet. But they're not hailing either. 40 minutes of silence. We broadcast on every Vethkai frequency we have. Their transponder is running. I can see it. They know we're here. They know what we are. Nora studied the vessel's configuration. Something was different about the way it was holding its position. Not a combat approach vector. Exactly. Something else. What's their engine output? Petra pulled it up. Erratic. Fluctuating every 40 seconds or so, like something cycling incorrectly in their drive system. They're damaged, Nora said. Possibly. Doesn't explain why they're pointing weapons at a hospital ship. No. She kept looking at the ship, but it might explain why they're not talking. The thing about Vethkai communication that most humans didn't understand was that silence was not the absence of speech. It was a speech act, a deliberate one, with specific grammatical function in their social architecture. Nora had learned this from a xenolinguist named Dr. Amara Cole, who'd spent 12 years living aboard Vethkai collector vessels before the current political tensions made that kind of exchange program impossible. Amara had written 3 papers that almost nobody outside special circles had read, and one of them was titled The Semiotics of Vethkai Reticence, Why We Misread Their Quiet as Hostility. Nora had read it twice, once because she was thorough, and once because the title had felt personally resonant in a way she hadn't examined closely. There were 4 primary categories of Vethkai's silence. According to Amara's taxonomy, there was Velketh, which was contemptuous silence, the silence you offer to something too beneath notice to warrant acknowledgement. There was Soramin, grief silence, which was a silence of those so deep in mourning that speech would be a form of profanity. There was Thekvai, silence as threat, which was what most humans assumed they were seeing in situations like this. And there was Emvil, which had no clean English translation, but approximated something like the silence of those who do not yet know what truth to speak. Looking at the erratic engine readings, looking at the weapons hot, but not firing, looking at the 40 minutes of no response to hails. They're in Emvil, Nora said aloud. Petra looked at her. What? They don't know what to tell us. It's not a threat silence. They're holding something we don't know about, and they haven't decided whether to disclose it yet. She paused. Their ship is hurt. Something happened to them. And they came toward us, specifically not away. And now they're sitting here saying nothing, because saying nothing is the only honest thing they know how to say right now. Falk turned to look at her fully. You're telling me that warship holding weapons on us is asking for help. I'm telling you it's possible. That's a significant possible. Nora, I know. A new sound from the sensor console. Petra's voice, stripped of its usual efficiency, tight in a way Nora hadn't heard before. Captain, they're increasing power to forward weapons array. The bridge went very quiet. Falk's jaw set. Helm, prepare evasive. Wait. Nora heard herself say it before she decided to. Wait. Let me try something. Nora, 30 seconds. Give me 30 seconds. He looked at her, that stillness of his, that trained absence of visible panic that she'd always found steadying before and found suffocating now. Then, 30 seconds, she moved to the communications console, and she asked the system for the Vethkai broadcast array, and she thought about what she knew about Emvil, about the silence of those who don't yet know what truth to speak. She keyed the broadcast and said nothing, just held the channel open. Silence transmitted deliberately, with the specific resonance frequency markers that Amara's paper had described as the formal indicators of Emvil response. The signal that said, I also do not yet know what truth to speak. I am here in the same not knowing. We can be quiet together until the truth becomes clear. 20 seconds passed. Then a sound came back through the channel that was not speech. It was a low, complex vibration, 3 distinct harmonics braided together, and the universal translation system flagged it as unclassifiable, which meant it was prelinguistic, which meant it was something closer to a gut response than a sentence. Amara's paper had a footnote about this particular harmonic signature. It meant, you see me, they're standing down the weapons array, Petra said. Her voice had changed completely. Captain, they're standing it down. They asked for a medical team, not in words, in another harmonic sequence, one that the universal translator actually managed this time, a request that came across as, we have those among us who require the intervention of those trained in the correction of broken biological systems. Nora went herself. Of course she went herself. She brought 2 nurses, Dominic Reyes and Sasha Cho, who were both xenobiology certified and had worked with non-human patients before, and she brought a translation module upgraded with the resonance frequency supplements she compiled from 3 years of Vethkai patient contact, which was not official equipment, and which Captain Falk had looked at and chosen not to ask questions about. The airlock between the 2 ships was a process. The Caduceus Meridian carried universal docking adapters, Hospital ships had to, and the automated negotiation between the two airlock systems took 6 minutes and felt like longer. Nora stood in the docking corridor and looked at the sealed inner door and thought about her daughter the way she always thought about her daughter, when she needed something to be bigger than fear. Her daughter's name had been Maya. She'd been 11 years old. She died of a very ordinary illness in a very well-equipped hospital with a very skilled surgeon. Not Nora, who had removed herself from the case because she understood what conflict of interest meant even when every cell in her body had screamed against the decision. And the surgeon had been skilled and the hospital had been equipped, and Maya had died anyway, because sometimes the truth was that the body chose a direction and no amount of skilled intervention could redirect it. Nora had spent a year after that wondering if the word helpless meant something she hadn't previously understood. She thought she understood it now. She'd built a working relationship with it. Helplessness was the baseline. What you did on top of the baseline, that was the work. The door opened. 3 Vethkai stood in the docking corridor. They were tall. Vethkai averaged nearly 2.5 meters, and their resonance membranes, the wide, translucent structures on either side of their upper thorax that served as their primary sensory and communicative organs, were showing a color pattern Nora recognized as acute stress. Pale gray-violet. The chromophores contracted, not threat coloration. Distress coloration. The one in front held its hands, four-fingered, with the characteristic Vethkai joint configuration that looked wrong to human eyes, like hands assembled from a slightly different instruction set, held them at chest height with the palms oriented outward. The translation module rendered this gesture as, "We come to posture those who carry something they cannot carry alone." Behind them, through the door, Nora could see a fourth figure on the floor. She moved past protocol, and instinct took over entirely. The Vethkai on the floor was in a state she'd only seen twice before in her career, what she had come to think of as a withdrawal configuration, where the entire body had tried to conserve function by shutting down peripheral systems first. Their resonance membranes were dark, nearly black. Their secondary circulatory system, visible through the semi-translucent skin of their thorax, had slowed to a pace that was unmistakably precritical. She knelt, opened her kit. The Vethkai physiology had enough structural documentation in the Meridian's medical database that she could run a basic assessment, but the specifics of what had happened, that she'd need from the 3 standing soldiers watching her with their membranes cycling through distress patterns she didn't have full vocabulary for. She looked up at the one who'd spoken in gestures. "Tell me what happened to them." The translation module worked in both directions. Imperfectly, always imperfectly, but enough. The Vethkai leader's response came through as fragmented. Corridor explosion. Resonance damage. 3 periods without intervention. 3 periods. Vethkai time measurement. She'd done the conversion enough times to know. Approximately 18 hours. 18 hours. Nora looked at the patient and felt the helplessness do its familiar thing, acknowledge and step back, and she started working. His name was Veth Karasolan, which translated imprecisely as something like the one who holds a chord that others have forgotten. She learned this while stabilizing a secondary circulatory system, which required a vascular support approach she developed herself because nothing in the standard protocols covered Vethkai resonance trauma comprehensively, and which she had to explain to Dominic twice before he could assist properly. Sasha had better instincts for the non-human physiological work. She had a Vethkai grandmother, the first and only Vethkai human family union she'd ever encountered, which meant Sasha had grown up with embodied knowledge of Vethkai expression and need that no training program could replicate. The Vethkai commander's name was rendered to the translation module as something close to collective voice wren. She was female in the Vethkai sense, which was more complex in the human sense and involved a social reproductive role that xenoanthropologists were still arguing about in papers Nora didn't have time to read. Wren stood near the doorway of the medical bay where they'd moved Solon and watched Nora work with her membranes doing something slow and complex that the translation module kept flagging as insufficient data for rendering. Nora found herself talking while she worked. She did this with all patients, a habit she developed early in her career, partly because the sound of a calm voice did measurable things to patient stress response even when the patient was unconscious, and partly because she needed something to do with the part of her brain that wasn't solving the immediate clinical problem. "You came toward us," she said to Run, without looking up, "when your ship was damaged and your crew member was injured. You came to a ship you knew to be a medical vessel, and then you couldn't ask for help directly. You wanted to, but you didn't know how. The translation module gave her Ren's response in pieces. We did not know if you would receive us. The engagement in the Verity corridor. Our forces were present. You may have lost people. We did. Then we did not know if the Red Cross still meant what it claims to mean. Nora paused in her work. Not long, just a breath. It means what it claims to mean. That's the only thing I can offer as proof. I'm here. Another membrane pattern from Run. Untranslatable. But she'd been watching Vethkai express things a translation module couldn't handle for 3 years, and she'd built her own internal vocabulary for the untranslatable ones. This one looked like something she might have called the specific grief of discovering that something you'd stopped believing in still exists. She went back to work. Solon stabilized 4 hours into treatment. Not recovered. Stabilized. He would need weeks of careful support before his resonance membranes recovered full function. Nora explained this to Run to the translation module, and Run was still for a long moment. And then the membrane pattern did something Nora had seen exactly once before, in a Vethkai patient on Kepler Station who had just been told that their bonded partner had survived surgery. She had no clinical name for it. In a Mars paper, it appeared in a footnote as Threnville Soa, which translated roughly as the sound the body makes when a feared loss does not occur. Nora had a human name for it. She'd always called it relief. It was during the second hour of Solon's stabilization protocol that Rin said, with the translation module working harder than Nora had ever heard it work, "Why does your ship carry a railgun?" She should have expected the question. She hadn't. Not because she didn't know the answer. She knew the answer completely, had thought about it extensively, had in fact been part of the working group that had drafted the policy documentation when it was first proposed 3 years ago. But because the clinical work had put her in a particular headspace, the one where the only real things were the patient and the problem and the solution, and the railgun was part of a different conversation. She asked Sasha to monitor Solon's secondary circulatory metrics, and she stepped into the corridor with Run, and she tried to find the right words for something she'd spent years finding the right words for. The Red Cross designation under interstellar medical law provides protection, she said. Any ship displaying those markings and registered as a medical vessel is supposed to be off-limits to hostile action under the accords that 41 species have signed. Ren's membrane. Supposed to. The Kara Secession didn't sign those accords. Neither did the Vethkai before the current administration. She paused, not as an accusation. As a fact, the Caduceus Meridian has been fired upon twice. Once by Karath interceptors who either didn't know or didn't care what the markings meant. Once by, she stopped, chose the next word carefully. Once by forces acting under a Vethkai fleet command 7 months ago in the Delva system. We lost a nurse and 14 patients. The corridor was quiet. Ren's membrane was doing the thing it did when the translation module flagged insufficient data for rendering. But the color pattern had shifted, darker, more contracted. After that engagement, Nora continued, there was a proposal at the Galactic Medical Conventions to equip all register hospital ships in active conflict regions with a single defensive railgun. Not offensive. The weapon can't target anything beyond a certain threshold of kinetic impact. It's physically constrained, built into the design. It fires once. A single shot. It's enough to destroy an incoming missile or damage the weapons array of a ship that's actively firing on us. That's the entire capability. You carry a weapon. We carry the means to survive long enough to keep doing our work. The cross says you're protected. The gun says you do not trust the cross. Nora looked at her. The cross says we should be protected. The gun says we've learned the difference between should and are. She held Ren's membrane gaze, the Vethkai equivalent of eye contact, a directional orientation of the sensory membranes, and said, 7 months ago, I was performing surgery when we were hit. The patient on my table was a Vethkai child, a 12-year-old who'd been caught in the Delva engagement crossfire. She survived the surgery. She didn't survive the second missile impact. Ren was perfectly still. The railgun was installed 2 months after that. I signed the authorization. Ren asked to see it. Nora thought about this for a moment, and then thought, why not? She took the Vethkai commander to the maintenance corridors to the aft weapons bay. which was the most unimpressive military installation she'd ever seen in her life. A single-rail assembly, minimal housing, an automated targeting and firing system that was locked behind 3 separate command authorizations, and a hardwired physical constraint that genuinely could not be overridden. Ren stood in front of it for a long moment. Her membranes were doing something slow and complex. "It has never fired," Nora said. "We've been threatened 4 times since installation. 3 times the threat withdrew when they confirmed we were armed. Once, 8 weeks ago, we were fired upon and the automated system destroyed the incoming warhead. And if someone fires on you again, the system fires back. Once. And then we continue doing our work." Ren's membrane pattern did something new. Something Nora didn't have vocabulary for. It was complex and slow, and involved a chromophore combination she'd never seen before. She watched it and waited, and the translation module tried 4 times, and then produced the specific quality of a thing that is both wrong and necessary simultaneously, for which there is grief and not condemnation. Nora let out a breath she hadn't known she'd been holding. "Yeah," she said, "that's what it is." Ren didn't leave after the railgun. She followed Nora on rounds, which Nora found strange, and then stopped finding strange. There was something in the Vethkai commander's quality of attention, a focused, non-intrusive presence, membranes oriented carefully so as not to intrude on patient privacy. That felt almost clinical, like she was learning something. Like this was not the first time she'd moved through a space where people were hurt, just the first time she'd done it as a visitor rather than a cause. Ward C was a critical care unit. Nora moved through the way she always moved, checking charts, checking faces, the specific way she'd learned to read pain and recovery across 14 different physiologies. The vocabulary of suffering, that was the one language she'd found that cut across species lines without much modification. In bed 7 was a Vethkai soldier, young, membrane coloration that suggested early maturity. He'd come in from the Verity corridor engagement with blast injuries to his lower thorax that had required 17 hours of surgery and had left him with permanent resonance membrane damage. His secondary sensory capacity would be degraded for the rest of his life. Rin stopped when she saw him. Nora watched the commander's membranes do something she didn't have vocabulary for either, then watched her walk to bedside and stand there and lower her resonance membranes in a posture that the translation module rendered as, "I see your cost. It is recorded." The young soldier's damaged membranes pulsed weakly in response. The translation module tried and produced only "acknowledged." Nora stood back and gave them what privacy the space allowed. She thought about what it meant to move through a space full of the people your decisions had broken. She thought about whether Ren had chosen to come on this ward walk, or whether something had brought her here that she couldn't name. She thought about the Vethkai child on her surgical table in Delva. She thought about Maya. She thought about how grief was one of the things that didn't require translation. Later, much later, when Solon was stable enough to be categorized as recovering rather than critical and the political machinery had begun its slow, grinding process of trying to formalize what to do about a Vethkai warship docked with a human hospital vessel, Rin found Nora in the observation corridor on Deck 7 where she'd started the day. The stars had not changed. They never changed on any human scale. That was either comforting or not depending on the day. "Can I ask you something?" Nora said, Ren's membranes oriented toward her. "When you came toward us, when your ship turned and came toward the meridian with Solon critical and your engines damaged, did you know we were armed?" A long pause. The slow, complex membrane pattern that meant Emvil. The silence of someone deciding what truth they can speak. "Then, no, we did not know. You came toward a hospital ship thinking we had no weapons. We came toward a hospital ship because our colleague was dying and you were the only option. We pointed weapons at you because we were afraid. We held silence because we did not know if mercy was something that still existed between our peoples. And then you answered in silence, and we understood that you were afraid too, and that you were still there." Nora was quiet for a moment. The stars outside the observation window did their permanent, indifferent thing. "If you'd known about the railgun," she said, "would you still have come?" The longest pause yet. "I do not know," Rin finally said. "That is the most honest answer I have." "That's the most honest answer anyone's given me in a long time," Nora said. Word got up to the political level fast. It always did. Nora received a priority communication from the Earth Interstellar Medical Authority 7 hours into the docking situation, instructing her that no formal communications or agreements with Vethkai military personnel were to be made without authorization from the diplomatic offices, that the current situation was politically sensitive and required careful management, and that her role was to continue medical operations while political personnel handled the broader situation. She read the communication twice, filed it, went back to Solon's bedside. The Vethkai political leadership, she gathered from the fragment of information filtering through, was having a parallel argument. A Vethkai warship docked voluntarily with a human medical vessel in a politically sensitive region after weapons had been raised on both sides was the kind of thing that could be either an incident or a precedent, and the question of which it would be was being debated at levels of authority that neither she nor Ran had access to. Ran had received similar instructions. Apparently, they didn't discuss this. They didn't need to. What happened in the medical bay between the patient and the people trying to keep that patient alive was not, in Nora's operational framework, a political event. It was a medical event. The distinction had a long history behind it, older than interstellar travel, older than the Geneva Conventions, old enough that it was part of whatever the word civilization tried to mean when it was being used carefully. Solon woke up on the 9th hour. The first thing he did was orient his resonance membranes, the functional one, the left. The damaged one moved only partially, and the chromophores on it were pale and struggling toward the nearest person, which was Nora. The translation module caught his first utterance and rendered it as, "You are the one who stayed. My team and I." Nora said, "Yes." His membrane pulsed. The right one, the damaged one, flickered with a chromophore pattern the translation module couldn't fully read, but she recognized it. She'd seen it in the 17 Vethkai patients before him. She'd seen it in human patients, too, in every language she'd ever worked in. It was a look of someone coming back from the edge and finding, against reasonable expectation, that the world was still there. In the corridor outside, she found Rin standing in the particular still way that Nora had come to understand meant she was processing something without exterior expression, giving it the interior space it needed. He's going to need ongoing support for his membrane function. Nora said, "I can write a full protocol. Your medical personnel would need to be trained in it. It's not standard Vethkai trauma medicine. I developed parts of it myself, but I can document everything. Ren's membranes. You would give us this. I'd give it to him. You'd be the mechanism." A pause. Then, "Our political offices have communicated that this docking should be treated as an emergency humanitarian action with no precedent implications." Mine said the same thing. "This is incorrect." Nora looked at her. "Yes. What has happened here is not without precedent implication. Something has occurred that did not previously exist. We came to you not knowing if mercy was possible and found that it was. This cannot be classified as nothing." "No," Nora agreed. "It can't. But I have also been in rooms where the word precedent has killed things that should have lived." Nora felt something settle in her chest. Not warmly. Honestly. So have I. The political machinery delivered its conclusion 14 hours after docking. It was on paper exactly what both sets of political offices had communicated it would be: an emergency humanitarian action with no precedent implications, a clinical non-event, a statistical blip. Ren's vessel would depart once Solon was stable enough for transfer. The Meridian would continue its route. Both parties would submit incident reports to their respective authorities. Diplomatic channels would handle any subsequent communications. Nora read the conclusion, filed it. Then she went to find the ship's communications officer, a young man named Theo Park, who had a particular quality of competence she'd come to rely on, and she asked him to verify something in the communication logs. When the Vethkai vessel approached us, she said, "Before they raise weapons, can you show me the trajectory reconstruction?" Theo was good at his job. He pulled it up without asking why. She looked at the trajectory. She looked at it for a long time. Then she said quietly, "They weren't heading toward us." Theo looked at the data. "The initial vector is..." He stopped. Looked again. "They were heading toward the Meridian's projected course position, not our actual position. They recalculated 3 times before. They were following our signal," Nora said. The medical transponder. They were tracking our broadcast and following it. She paused. They raised weapons when we altered course, and they thought they'd been detected. They thought we were going to run. Theo processed this. So when we held position, we accidentally communicated that we weren't afraid of them, that we were willing to wait. She looked at the trajectory again. They'd been following us for 6 hours, Theo, before they came into sensor range, before any of this started. She went to find run. Rin received this information the way Nora was learning. She received most difficult information. Very still, membranes in the pattern of Emvil, the silence of someone deciding what truth to speak. Then, Solon began deteriorating 8 hours before you detected us. You were looking for us specifically. We knew your route. Hospital ships broadcast their routes. We knew if we could reach you. You came to a human hospital ship for your soldier. I came to the only ship in range that had the capability to help him. Your species. Your vessel. I did not know if you would help us. I did not know if the Red Cross still meant what it claims to mean for us after Delva. A pause. I had decided that if you ran, I would not pursue you. The weapons were raised because my crew was afraid, not because I ordered it. I overrode the order 3 seconds after it was given. You broadcast your silence 2 seconds after that. We almost... She didn't complete the sentence. The membrane pattern did something complex and dark. 2 seconds, Nora said. 2 seconds. They stood with that for a moment. The Vethkai forces in Delva, Nora said carefully. The strike on us. Did you know about it? The longest silence yet. I was not present. I was not part of that command structure. But I knew afterward what had been done. A pause. Solon was in Delva. He was young. He did not fire on your ship. But he was there, and he has carried it since then. This is why, when he woke, he said what he said. Nora went back through it. You are the one who stayed. Not gratitude for the medical care. Not simple relief at recovery. The specific recognition of someone who'd been prepared to be abandoned, who believed on some level they deserved to be abandoned, finding that the thing they thought they'd forfeited was still being offered. She thought about the Vethkai child on her surgical table. She thought about whether she had been, in that moment, waiting for a reason to offer or a reason to withhold. She knew the answer. She'd known it for 3 years. It was a reason she'd signed a Railgun authorization, and the reason she'd spent 19 hours in surgery after the Verity corridor, and the reason she was standing here in this corridor on a hospital ship 7 light years from any place that called itself home. The cross means what it claims to mean, she said. That is not conditional. The official incident report was filed. 2 paragraphs. Emergency humanitarian action, no precedent implications, clinical non-event. Nora wrote a different document, not an official one, a research paper or the beginning of one. She'd need Amara Cole's help to do it properly, and she'd already drafted a message to Amara that she hadn't sent yet. It was a clinical paper on Vethkai resonance trauma treatment protocols, with detailed documentation of the methods she developed and refined across 17 patients and 1 critical case. The kind of paper that would go into medical databases on both sides of the political line, if anyone chose to put it there. The kind of paper that, if a Vethkai military medic read it, would give them something they didn't currently have. She named it Resonance Trauma and Recovery in Vethkai Patients, a revised clinical protocol. She did not name Solon in it. She didn't name Run. She didn't name the ship. She documented the clinical events with the specific identifying details removed the way medical ethics required. And she wrote in the introduction that the cases described had occurred in a context that demonstrated, among other things, the practical value of cross-species medical knowledge sharing for the simple reason that suffering did not observe political boundaries, and neither, in the end, did the people trying to address it. That last part would probably be edited out before publication. She put it in anyway. Solon was transferred back to the Vethkai vessel on the 16th hour, stable and documented, and equipped with the full protocol. She'd trained 2 of their medical personnel herself. Dominic had run 3 practice sessions with their equipment to make sure the adaptations worked. Sasha had spent 4 hours in quiet conversation with Solon himself, their membrane resonance matching in a way that the translation module didn't need to address. Rin stood at the airlock for the departure. The translation module was in Nora's pocket. She didn't reach for it. Wren oriented her membranes toward Nora and held the orientation for a moment that was its own complete and sufficient thing. Then she produced a resonance pattern that the translation module, if she'd had it out, would probably have processed for several seconds and then produced something inadequate for. Nora had spent 3 years building a vocabulary for the untranslatable. This one looked like, I will remember what is possible. She produced what she hoped was the correct formal gesture, palms forward, orientation of the head in a specific angle that indicated that the exchange was bilateral, that the debt, if existed, was shared and not owed, and said, in English that the translation module on Wren's side would catch. So will I? The airlock closed. In her cabin, later, Nora sat with her communications terminal and opened the unsent message to a Maricole and read it back and then added a paragraph at the end about what Vethkai's silence actually looked like in practice, what Emble felt like from the inside of conversation, and what she thought it meant that a weapon system and a treatment protocol had both been necessary to get 17 people home safely. She wrote, I used to think the railgun was a compromise. Now I think it's part of the same thing. Both say we are here. Both say we are not leaving. The difference is only in the direction we're facing when we say it. She sent the message. Outside the observation window on Deck 7, the stars were doing what they always did. Permanent, indifferent, beautiful in a way that things are beautiful when they predate every argument you've ever had about what anything should mean. Nora watched them for a while. Then she went to do rounds.